Hello and a warm welcome to Property Summits, the show with all the advice you need to improve or expand your property business. I'm Emma Birchley, and on hand as ever is our team of hugely knowledgeable experts. First off, we have Richard Bush, the co-founder of Crowdlaws, which pools resources to enable more people to benefit from investing in property. With us too is investor and property developer Paul Mahoney, a serial entrepreneur and best-selling author. Ranjan Bhattacharya is here too, a man full of top tips on how to succeed in property after 3 decades in the business. Tony Gimple also joins me, the man to know when it comes to advice on tax, accountancy or succession planning. Then we have John Howard, who's seen it all after 40 years in the property game. And finally, Nicholas Wallwork, an investor and developer who makes the most of his expertise in his role as CEO of the world's largest international property forum, providing advice on how to make money through property. Hello, gentlemen. Lovely to see you all. Now, Nicholas, today we're talking about planning, the planning process, which can be a stumbling block for some before you even start.
Yeah, it can be for some. I think we'd describe it more of a whinge about the planning process, potentially, rather than a discussion. I'm sure there'll be a heated debate. I think for property developers and investors, it is seen as a huge hurdle. It is a huge hurdle. But I think, to summarise that big hurdle in our industry, it's about proper planning, it's about the right advice, it's about knowing the processes, knowing the loopholes, not being afraid to challenge and push back on the council on certain points. There is always an element of negotiation. You're dealing with individual people and always have done throughout that process. So I believe there's an element of people skills to it, but it's largely about preparation and doing all your reports. The planning process was first implemented, or the first reference to it, I think in 1909, and then it sort of became more and more a formalised process throughout the century. And ultimately, they just added more and more rules, things you couldn't do. So then it was about kind of knowing those rules and adapting your developments to match. Today, we're in a period where there's a lot of permitted development. And if you've done any property whatsoever, it will be a phrase you're well aware of. It's been around for quite a few years. I think it was 2013, would it be right? Ranjan's my PD co-expert here. And that's started off quite relaxed, and it was a more relaxed process than a formal planning. And I think it was there to spur on mainly old commercial buildings and get them recycled back into residential property. And everyone made a lot of hay whilst the sun was shining for 3 or 4 years there. And we were in quite early on that period, which was great. And we did a lot of nice developments. And then gradually they've added more and more rules and regulations and tightened it. They've got more control, and it's becoming more like the traditional planning system, regrettably. That being said, and on reflection, I'll put this out to the guys to chat about, but I think they've done that because they want to almost systemise the planning process. Before a planning application was, it was a set of rules. There was quite a lot of unknown. There was quite a lot of human judgment from the planning officer and the council's point of view as to whether they liked it or not. And then it would be put out for consultation to the public and whether they liked it or not, and if they had any, viable planning complaints about it. But by trying to systemise, I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt here, guys, the council. I'm sure you guys might think differently. By trying to systemise it and lay out clearly what is allowed, in theory, and that's through the permitted development process, in theory, if you tick those boxes, you should be able to get what you want if you pick the right site. So part of the skill now is picking the right site where you can tick those boxes, and you can create a viable product at the end of it. The question is, will that continue, or will they continue to throttle the planning process and stifle what I as a developer feel is a quick and easy way of getting planning to deliver much needed stock? Who knows?
Just to really rewind back, for people who really might be new to property developing and don't understand the planning process, explain it in terms of the council officers who are the paid employees, their role, the planning committee, who then sit there and are the ones doing the voting, deciding whether it goes ahead. Explain that whole thing.
Okay, so essentially you'll either put in a full planning application, which is where there's no permitted development rights, or you'll put in a prior notification application, which is for those permitted development rights. So essentially you're allowed to do that development, provided it fits the tick boxes. And they have 56 days to respond on that. officially, although they can.
And who is responding? The actual council?
The council officers, yeah. Depending on the size of the development and the sort of the contentious nature of it, often one officer would be, able to make a decision if it's a small enough site. If it's a bigger one, it tends to go to a committee type arrangement. And then, of course, if you fail the planning, you can appeal and go to an appeals committee, and a council appeals officer will come out and review it, and it will go through various processes there. That's a last resort. But sometimes if an officer digs their heels in on something, just because they don't like it, and we've had sites where they just throw silly thing after silly thing after silly thing after you, trying to make you give up, basically. And that's what the appeal's there for.
But Nicholas, you might consider it silly, but they might have a very good, planning reason why. We're all very biased against planners, and it's slightly unfair, to be honest with you. And I think it's unfair for a number of reasons. First of all, there aren't enough planning officers, because not anybody, but a lot of planning officers aren't paid particularly well. So when they get the opportunity to go into private business as a planning consultant, they leave. That's the first thing. Secondly, they are flooded with planning applications, and I mean flooded across the UK. They can't cope, and they have 3 months, don't they, Nicholas, to
in theory,
to give planning or refuse planning. And what I'm finding is that they don't. When you put the application in, they're not registering it straight away, because they can't get it through within the 12 months.
So that means
12
that
weeks.
Period doesn't start straight
Exactly.
away.
So what they're doing, and we've got one at the moment
in
near
pile
Birmingham.
on the desk.
Yeah, they've got a big pile on the desk. They can't cope, and so the application is sitting there for 6 or 7 weeks before they register it. Now that's wrong. That is wrong. So
What
I
do
agree
they do
with
though
you.
if they don't have the staff?
Well,
Hire more staff.
Hire more staff. Yeah, I don't even notice
Make
though.
the silly rules simpler.
Everywhere you go,
make the rules
you
simpler.
can't get enough staff. Oh, make
Well,
the rules
Make
simpler.
simpler rules.
This is what I said earlier. It's the PD rules
is.
are, I think, giving them the benefit of the doubt, making it simpler and more processed. So
I don't give these guys benefit of the doubt, and here's why. When you submit a planning application, who do you put the application to? You put it to the Development Control Department. It's not called the Development Enablement Department.
Yeah.
The culture of those organisations is to find a reason to reject. That's what they go. That is the culture and the ethos behind their whole reason for being.
Does everyone
to
agree
find
with
a
that?
reason?
Yeah.
No, I don't. I don't entirely agree.
Well, this is the crux of
Rename
the
them
housing
enablement
problem,
departments.
right? The reason, a big part of the reason there is an undersupply of properties is it's very difficult to supply them.
Exactly.
So I agree. I think they should clear these places out or change the cultures
but Paul,
to incentivise development.
but I understand that it is an issue and it does limit the number of developments that happen, but do you not appreciate the value of having a department of people who are there to control what is developed?
Yes.
Without that, it would be
Of course,
like the Wild West.
that's required
No,
within reason.
That's one extreme.
property anarchy, we can do what we want.
That's,
whatever
yeah,
we want.
that's one extreme to
For the good
another.
part.
I mean, other countries have zoning systems where certain types of developments are permitted within a particular zone, which perhaps doesn't have old buildings to protect or outviews and vistas to protect. So we just have these masses of rules that apply to every plot everywhere, and that snarls it up. So we're not saying Wild West, no, but we're saying a system of simplified, logical rules, because then what developers need is certainty. Because if you buy a plot or a site and you don't know whether you're going to get planning at all, or whether it's going to take 8 weeks or 8 years, then you can't fund it. And if you can't fund it, there's no certainty to the whole process.
But I suspect if we had
You can fund it.
Of course I can fund it.
You can fund it privately. Richard,
But that is an issue that's
some
snarling
banks,
up developers.
for some of us, well, all of us here who are experienced, some banks will take a view because they believe that, we know what we're doing, and 9 out of 10 times, hopefully, we get it right. But don't forget this pre-application. Do you want to just, because the pre-application is important as well,
I will, but I want to address your point there, John, is that traditional banks won't lend you development finance until you've got the planning approved. So you're stuck to a bridge loan, which is very expensive and sometimes make the deal unviable. So if it was more simple with the permitted development rules, where everyone sort of assumed you could get planning because it does tick these boxes and you can evidence that to the bank, wouldn't it be great to get development finance off the bat without planning, and the planning was just a formality? But it's definitely not like that.
Well, that's never going to happen, is it?
never-
Because no one is going to
No.
forward funds on the basis that you can do something that you can't be sure that you can do. That that
well,
is
you
never
should.
gonna-
That's what I'm saying. Is you want to shore up the ability. You can do it.
Yeah.
And permitted development in the early days was you were pretty damn sure you could do it.
But you still wouldn't get funding until you had the consent.
No, you still couldn't. No, but I'm just saying, wouldn't it be wonderful if you could?
But there's a way.
It should be that simple.
But Nicholas, there is a way around this partly, and I understand you're playing devil's advocate, and you're very passionate about this. And I understand that, and don't get me wrong, I'm frustrated, like everyone here and everyone watching, probably who's involved with planning.
Yep.
However, pre-application, just explain pre-application, because that is important. If you get a good pre-application, you can fund it probably on that basis. So, yeah.
I've not been able to fund anything on that basis, Richard. No.
I do.
Who with? Can I have your bank, please?
I do. So, explain.
Yeah, I mean, a pre-application is supposed to be a cut down. It's when you need full planning, when it's not a permitted development right site. And in theory, they're supposed to respond within 28 days. Again, they ask for informal extensions to that 9 times out of 10. And regrettably, that can spoil a deal, because I don't want to exchange on a deal that's too risky without a pre-app. And we sometimes try and push a pre-app through
But
before
the pre-app
exchange.
is a personal opinion of the planning officer at the time who's at the council to say, yes, in principle, we agree with what you're doing, and in principle, that should be acceptable. The problem is that planning officer can then leave, and it's a personal opinion of the planning officer, not the council. So be careful on pre-apps.
And the pre-app is not legally binding.
And it's not legally binding.
On Monday, we looked at a development in Birmingham that had a very good pre-planning application.
Yes.
And we didn't buy it because they wouldn't do it subject to planning.
Do you think we should?
Well,
maybe we should go back and make another bid.
What I'm getting at here
I thought you could fund it with that.
What I'm getting at here is that's 20 units that could have been delivered in 18 months to the Birmingham Central market that requires more properties that we will now not build because we don't want to take the risk on planning.
No.
The problem with a pre-app, before we move on, this is an important point. In a pre-app, it's only as good as the information you provide to the council at that time. So really, if you want to get a much firmer pre-app response, you've got to do all the reports, the highways reports, contamination, land, environmental,
honestly,
be as thorough as you possibly can.
You've got to put in a full package on planning.
I spend about £5,000 to £7,000 on a pre-application. That's what I spend.
I mean, that's a big punt, isn't it, if you're a normal person, not you big boys?
Well, there's people a lot bigger than us and much more successful than us. But I mean, you have to, if you're in the business, you've got to do the thing professionally and properly. And you have to accept the fact you're going to have to push the money around and potentially cost you a little bit of money to get the big prize.
It's
You
better
can't
to risk
expect to get the big
5,000
prize
than
without putting some
I think the people need to be aware that pre-apps are not legally binding. No. And actually, we had a case last year where we got a favourable pre-app, and then the council wrote to us 10 days later and say they withdrew it.
That's horrendous. Awful.
And it's a long story. I can't go into that now. But they basically withdrew it, and I got a barrister to look into it, and they are at liberty to do so.
So that leads me on to what I wanted to ask.
Has no standing.
Which is, why fundamentally do you think that planning departments are controllers, not enablers? Why would they want to be? Why do they want to make it tough?
It's responsibility. A council officer is getting paid 30 grand a year to do a job. They don't want responsibility of something going wrong and signing off a 50 flat scheme in the middle of Canary Wharf that costs millions of pounds and affects thousands of people and getting it wrong. They're afraid.
Because they, as an individual, are liable, or their job is on the line.
It could be any number of those things, but what's the incentive to them to approve it?
It's also the
only
way the
risk.
system's set up.
Culture.
The difficulty is us as developers, we need to be careful what we say here, because there's so much influence by that individual person's opinion that you almost need to try to become friends with them to get what you want. That's wrong.
Well,
or at least understand
there should be a system
their point
where
of view.
if you tick the right boxes, like PD in some cases, you can do it.
Yeah.
Whereas in a lot of cases, these things just get signed off because that individual person
Feels
can't be bothered or doesn't feel like it on the day.
I think we're being a bit harsh here.
I do too.
And I'm not saying that just because I got a few planning applications.
You love planners.
And I love you all. I love you all. I'm not just saying that because of that reason. But, the planning officer has a boss. They have a chief planning officer who they go to, who've got more experience than them, and will sign things off for them. The problem I find is the speed of which they do things. I've got a situation at the moment on preconditions. Now, preconditions are worth talking about, because when you get planning permission now, there are a set of preconditions you have to adhere to and get
Boxes
signed
you need
off
to tick.
before you can start. And my planning consultant, who's very good, said to me, John, there will be a time soon when you have planning permission, but you won't be able to adhere to all the planning conditions. They're so difficult to get signed off that actually you have planning, but you can't build anything. So what I would say to anyone listening who thinks they've got planning, that's great, but make sure you get all those preconditions dealt with. They could take anything up to a year to do.
Give us examples of what they are.
Well, it might be the landscaping is an obvious one, but it might be that you have to put an application in as to what landscaping you're doing. That would be a good one. It might be a flood, something to do with flooding. It might be that you need a new one, which is rain gardens, where the council now won't allow you to put all the water into the main drains. So you need to spread the water out, the rainwater from the gutterings out across the whole site in case it floods not just your site but someone else's site. So that's all to do with global warming. So there's lots of new things which have come in. And it's very difficult to get them all signed off before you start. And you can't start before you have.
I've just had one that required a mining report.
Yeah.
That was 15 grand.
Yeah.
Really?
That I didn't know I had to pay.
But the thing is, they split them into two. They do pre-commencement conditions,
Yes, pre-commencement.
which means before you start physically building, and
Yeah.
then pre-occupation, which is before
Yes.
your end tenant moves in
Yes.
or you've sold them. It's the pre-commencement ones that are a problem, because if that does take another 9 months, you've just been through maybe a 6-month planning window to get the planning, and you can then finance it, with cheaper finance than your bridge loan, with the land and development finance. But then you've got another 6 months maybe or more of getting rid of these blooming conditions
I
before you
think
can
these
start.
conditions are so
It's a
serious
joke.
that I will not buy a site that's got planning unless all the preconditions have been dealt with.
That is
But
correct.
some preconditions presumably make a bit of sense. I'm just thinking about a development not far from me where the flats, they're nice flats, they're all empty. Something was missed because the developers have withdrawn from the site, they're just waiting to sell them, and there is no landscaping. No. There's a great big circular thing for rainwater and flooding, and it looks a disaster zone, and no one's buying them.
And Emma, that's totally wrong. That's totally wrong. They are important, these preconditions, but they're so onerous that it's almost impossible in certain cases to get, and they're taking up to a year, even longer to do. And they're expensive to sort out as well. So please, anyone, buying a development, got planning, the preconditions are just as important as the planning.
When you get the granting of consent, on the first page it says permission granted.
You go, wow, fantastic.
And then there's 4 or 5 pages, and sometimes 40, 50 conditions.
Yeah.
And some of them are, they want to know about the finishing materials, so samples of the brick and tiles that
Which
you're
is
using.
fair enough.
Which is fine,
Yeah.
but it's all very well when you send them along and then they get lost. And then you get someone to hand deliver them, and then they get lost again. And you wonder, whether these things are...
Which is really what
It's glacial.
It's
the
the
speed
that,
of getting
that really does our heads in.
Yes.
It harps back actually to the preparation. So that
Yeah.
one of the points of this particular show was how do we smash the planning process, right? So how do we deal with all these problems? And ultimately it's about that preparation beforehand. It's knowing what all the tick boxes are. It's knowing all the consultants that might be needed. If you can get your tile samples in whilst your planning's in, it won't be a condition. So you're almost trying to head off as many realistic
Anticipate
conditions.
the problems.
Anticipate as many potential conditions for that site, and that's a real skill to go and look at this site. What are they going to want to know? Where we're sat in this studio, there's the DLR track out the back. Well, you'd be wanting to get a noise survey for this one without a doubt.
Yep.
So certain sites you can just see what they're going to go for, and also a good planning consultant help you see as you're an experienced developer, John, as we're all experienced investors around the table. But we can see so many, but then getting good planning consultants on top of our knowledge.
But it does get worse and worse and worse, Nicholas, and that's why we're talking about it. They're piling more and more on us all.
For you all as experienced investors, maybe if you have done a lot of developments in a certain area, you may have built a relationship with the planning officer, or you're lucky enough to be able to afford a planning consultant or something. But for your average person, how easy is it or hard is it to get close to the planning officers to find out what is actually going to be required, so that you can preempt the requirements, show them the tiles, the bricks?
The easiest way is a pre-app.
Okay.
Because they will come
It's
for a
still
meeting
paperwork,
with you.
though, it's-
that
oh,
officer will come
okay.
out for a
Right.
meeting.
For planning.
If
It'll
you're
only
lucky.
cost you a few hundred quid.
Okay.
And you can have, as long as you've drawn some basic architect's drawings of what you're hoping to do.
You can have a proper discussion.
can have a
and
discussion
go
and
through the
try and
questions
figure
and
it out
be
later.
I'd go
organised.
so
Yeah.
far as to say, Emma, that if you can't afford a planning consultant, you shouldn't be developing property.
Right.
agree.
So
These
does everyone?
days.
That's what
These
people.
days.
Professional consultants are very, very important.
Although I would say, I do find that sometimes, a first-time developer, not knowing a lot, actually gets hold of the planning officer, which we can never seem to do, and
Yeah.
actually gets some support, because they are there to help. They are there to help and advise.
And enable.
And enable, allegedly. So, they are. It is worth try to talk to them if you can. A lot of them won't speak to you. You just have to do it all by email now,
They're
which
working
is
from
crazy.
home, watching Holly Willoughby and doing all of that with their...
Ranjan, you can't say that.
Well, I had one of my students did a application. They're trying to get hold of the planning officer for a decision, and actually got an email the next day. Sorry, I couldn't get back to you yesterday because my cat was on the keyboard. That was what.
Well, at least you got
someone
at least they got a
as
response.
Wow.
I mean,
they got a response.
they're working from home, doing their stuff. That was, it's just ridiculous, quite frankly. That's one of the main reasons you can't get hold of anyone on the phone, because since COVID, everyone's, I just say at home rather than working at home. But
You definitely can't say that, Ranjan. Some people are very, very productive at home.
well, the ones in the private sector.
Anyway, moving on. Tony, what do you think about the whole planning process?
It's less about the planning process and more about the discussion seems to have been where you're all starting. Well, surely the best place to start is where you want to finish and reverse engineer the process. What do they say in the military? Proper preparation prevents poor performance. And okay, yes, no plan survives first contact. But by the same token, if you've got to get a pre-application, fully understand what the planners are looking for, understand it from their perspective, knowing that there may well be conditions, that you've got to go back with kind of brick, tiles, pollution, EPCs, the works. Well, hang on a second. If we're going to be professional developers and run it as a business, be it you're doing your first one or your umpteenth one, you have to have that vision of what that finished product will look like. And from there, put everything in place so when it does land on the planner's desk, they've got the minimum work necessary. You've handled the objections, you've handled the materials, you've handled the pollution, you know what the outcome would be. And if, when you've done all that work, they still haven't signed it off, or there's been NIMBYism, right, then you've got legitimate grounds to moan.
The building regulations, are they part of that whole, do you put them under the planning process bracket?
Yes.
So you can get to the final
Yeah.
hurdle, can't you, and think you've kind of done it, and then the building regs.
Not really. I think the planning system is about what you're allowed to build, and the building regulations is how you construct it. So you can always construct it according to the rules. There may be a cost, but you'll always be able to construct what you're given permission to build.
But it could be challenging.
And expensive.
One thing I will just say is that the local council association believe that 90% of all applications are successable. That's what they put out.
That's true.
But that includes...
Eventually, ultimately, after a million revisions.
I can only
and
think they mean, but that 90% of the applications that are recommended by the planning officer that go to the committee are accepted. That's what they must mean.
John,
it includes things like, can I paint my front door, or can I put a sign up, or they're all part of the planning.
and tree
They're all
preservation
not-
orders,
not all
chopping a
done.
tree.
Mine about 50%, so I'm doing something terribly wrong.
I've got just a really quick question for Richard. In terms of funding, do the funders look I know the answer to this, but I want you to answer it from your perspective.
See if I get it right.
How much weight do they put on the conditions on the planning application? Because as we've said,
Complete. I mean, one of the first things we look at when we look at a potential funding a project is the planning, permission, and all the preconditions, both the pre-start ones.
do they need to be got rid of? Do they
No,
need
they
to
just have to be reasonable.
Okay. So
There
you
might
do
be,
take
if there's
the risk
something
on
in
them.
there that we're not familiar with or that is onerous,
Yep.
then we would probably wait.
Yeah.
until it-
Okay,
Yeah.
well that's
It
a
makes a
good
lot of
point.
sense because it affects the time frame.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
In
A
which
good
regard?
point to wrap it up. You were all hugely informative as ever. And thank you so much for joining us. And we'll see you next time.